Hello YouTube, I hope you're having a great day today. Today I want to take a look at a sequel of a book that I wrote, reviewed for you. It's one of my first books I reviewed for you, Hero's Journey from the 70s. And today I want to take a look at its sequel, The Unforsaken Hiero, which was written about 7 or 8 years later. It was initially kind of planned by the writer Sterling Lanier to be the first of a trilogy, but he never got to the third book. He wasn't a fast writer. He only wrote a few short stories in the sort of Brigadier Fellows series that kind of plots this adventure series, and then he wrote 3 novels, and that's it. So I've read them all. I've got everything that he wrote, but it's not much. He did a lot of other things. He was an editor and stuff. But we'll take a look. I want to do the follow-up to his novel from the mid-70s, which I really love a lot. I've been really inspired recently to do a couple of little themes for you. So we're kind of going to be doing the second of a 3-part video series. The first one kind of began with Brian Aldiss's Hot House, which just was published for you. Then this one. And then my next one for you is going to be, which I'm actually going to record as soon as I finish this, but I won't publish it for a little bit. It's actually going to be Fred Saberhagen's, the first book in his Empire of the East series. And the goal is to kind of show you some post-apocalyptic fantasy works rather than post-apocalyptic science fiction works. If you're familiar with stuff after the 70s, you might be familiar that a lot of sort of the things that we have really moving from, I'd say, from about halfway through the 70s on, science fiction and fantasy tend to not cross the streams. You're not going to be coming across a lot of works in media, science fiction, fantasy, video games, and so forth that seem like they're one and then will cross the stream to the other, or vice versa. It still happens here and there, particularly in the early 80s. There are some video game series like Ultima, the first Ultima, or the Might and Magic series, which seem like they're traditional fantasy, but when you start finding out that actually this world was super secretly, like, it has spaceships from the stars that have crashed on it that you're going to be exploring, or you're using blaster weapons that are referred to as ancient weapons later on in the game, in the post-game and stuff. So there are these little little holdovers and such, but for the most part, people want their fantasy, and they want their science fiction. But there was a while when these genres were not as strongly sort of codified, and so the rules weren't as strict, and so you regularly would have people who were writing worlds that were more science fantasy. And we have a lot of examples of that, of fantasy-style worlds that are either set near the end of the world, where fantasy rules are starting to come back, like Jack Vance's Dying Earth series, or you had things like the ones that we're about to look at. Post-apocalyptic event has occurred, and as a result, the world has sort of been thrown back to this fantasy-esque style of world building. And again, that began with Hero's Journey and Sterling Lanier. And I talked to you about this before, but in short, it's a 1970s novel, wherein the lead character, Hiero Desteen, is a ranger for the church up in the northern parts of Canada that survived the post-apocalyptic world. He is psychic, can psychically connect to his best friend, this bear, who's also psychic and intelligent. He rides this giant mutated moose, and so on and so forth. And he's out there on the sort of the precipice, meeting new people, taking out things for the good guys, and so on and so forth. And he's traveling, meeting a lot of people, and so on and so forth. Well, as a part of that story, near the end of the story, he's gonna rescue this lady near one of the Great Lakes, and eventually she's gonna help him out and so forth. And near the end of the story, they're gonna start to become a full-on couple, and such. So what's gonna happen in the sequel is they're actually gonna go to her home country over in Delaware, or what's left of Delaware, in the post-apocalyptic universe. Now, because this is a post-apocalyptic universe, again, there's going to be a lot of things that are happening. It's got to have, it'll have places that have fallout and so forth, technology, although it's going to be like 70s technology, and what 70s people thought of technology, not necessarily how we would write technology today. So there's going to be like giant banks of computers and so forth that have not survived, stuff like that you would expect kind of from that era. But anyway, the point here, though, is that you're going to have these monsters, you're going to have these bad guys that you're fighting that are kind of mutated. You got these, these humanoid species and so forth, as well as species that have, sort of come into fruition. And the first book I've talked about before, how impactful it is and how it has really I think it's a forgotten classic in that most people don't realize how important it was. Modern fantasy, whether it's video games, board games, movies, and so forth, books, novels, comics, whatever media you're reading in fantasy for the last 20, 30, 40 years has taken a lot from Hiero's journey, but without crediting it, whether it's the druids or the concept of leveling up while you progress and how you get stronger after and literally your powers are getting stronger as the story goes along because of your abilities as have strengthened psychically over the course of the storyline. So you get a chance to see that actually in literature before it ever was a part of a game system. So all these different things are coming from this book. So I really wanted to read his follow-up book. I picked it up as soon as I read the first book, and I read it. So let's take a look at the Unforsaken Hiero. Now, the Unforsaken Hiero, I'm going to give you some basic plot notes, and then I have one major issue with the story, and I'll talk about that because it happens early-ish. It probably happens about 25% of the way through the story, so I don't consider it to be too much of a spoiler, and it is. It's on the back of the book. So it's not like I'm going to be giving you away something you would not find out if you read the back cover of the book. And why I'm not a super big fan of it. But let's talk about it. Anyway, so him and his new wife and lady are going to head out to Delaware over on the coast and get a chance to kind of explore her area and her land, so forth. And the idea is that you're now going to get a chance to see, you as a reader, him as a writer are going to get a chance to see, and the main character, Hiero Desteen, has not been out that way either. So you get a chance to do some exploring, adventuring out that way, and so forth. You're going to run into some stuff on the way there. And so forth. It's more of a political place with a lot of civilization, which is kind of the exact opposite of the places up north in kind of Canada and such, where you had been reading before, or the Midwest, as he was adventuring out there. Places like Ohio and stuff, where there's very few towns, there's very few people still alive. It's more of a kind of a wilderness, kind of a traditional fantasy kind of a setting. But here it's a little more built up. There's more political maneuvering and backstabbing and so forth. And so as a result of Hiero arriving with his lady friend and so forth, he is going to be captured, and they're going to remove his psychic powers using this drug. So he's going to be without his psychic powers for the rest of the story. Now I understand the reason why the writer probably felt this was necessary. By the end of the first book, his powers had grown to the point where he was probably one of the strongest people with his psychic powers. So in order to make his story believable, some writers would just, they would probably just continue to up, the level of threat that they're going up against. Somebody who might be immune to psychics or whatever. Or somebody who's more and more powerful. In order to continue to give you a villain that makes sense. In this case, the writer has chosen instead to strip him of the power that he gained, as well as all the other psychic powers that he had too, which were really cool. And as a result, so I understand why to do it. It kind of brings him back down. It makes him more vulnerable, makes him more risky. It makes his travel afterwards, his battles, his stuff much more gritty, believable, like he's going to die at any point in time. But it's like having a story with a mage without having, you wouldn't want to read a Gandalf story after he was stripped of reading his magic or something like that. I wouldn't want to read, an Elminster story in the Forgotten Realms after he was stripped of his magic or something like that. So I'm not a super fan of it. I still liked it. I love the world building, and I would have liked to have seen a sequel. And if there was a sequel, I would not have been surprised if he ended up getting his powers restored as a part of that sequel. Because I understand, kind of the journey, the bringing them back down to reality. I get that, and I get why your world building may not have had bad guys. So in order to continue your story, I understand from a story building perspective, world building perspective, so forth, why you needed to do it. It just, I didn't like it for that reason, though. Because again, it didn't feel... I want to read a story about, this great psionicist. I want to read him having psionic battles like he did in the first book, so forth. So anyway, that's the Unforsaken Hiero. But otherwise, it's fun. Lots of fun things are happening. Again, lots of exploring. You're meeting characters, getting a real chance to flesh out the world and such. And this post-apocalyptic fantasy world, which I love so much. I mean, the world of Hiero is just so much fun. It's also kind of sad that this second book is the last time this world has ever been visited. So after you read these two books, you're done. You're never going to go back. There's no video games. There's no role-playing games, there's no other media, there's no books, there's no comics, nothing. So once you're done with these 2 books, you're done, which I actually think is kind of sad because it's so much fun. This was stuff on Gary Gygax's Appendix N. It was really influential on Dungeons & Dragons and later fantasy that came along. It's a whole lot of fun. But unfortunately, this is it. So if you haven't had a chance to read the first book, I recommend you do it strongly, then read this one. The first book is very quick. I'll actually link you to both books below on Amazon in case you want to pick them both up. And also, if you read the first one but you haven't read the second one, hey, get to it. It's not going to take you very long. Lanier is not the sort of writer who's going to take like days and days and days to read his stuff and so forth. So anyway, well, we will take a look at Lanier's 3rd and final book later on, Menace Under Marswood, which I've read probably a few months ago. It's also not bad. It's a little different because it's set on Mars and so forth, but it still has this kind of style of writing. He's definitely somebody. He was an editor, and he definitely believes in having very, very, very florid prose. So when you read his stuff, it's going to be very, very, very black hat. It's funny that I'm wearing a black hat. It's very white hat and black hatish, so forth. It's got a very pulp feel to it, even though it's not written in the pulp styles. It's written in the 70s and the 80s, but it feels very pulp, very sort of old school throwback. Fantasy and science and post-apocalyptic fantasy, so it's fun. And after the explosions and such, so check it out and let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video, hey, there's no reason not to hit that subscribe button down in this corner. We'll be bringing you a large number of reviews of classics and forgotten works in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And if you watch this video, hey, I want to appreciate it that you took some time out of your day to invest in this video. I really do appreciate it. So thanks so much for your time.